Okay. It's with great pleasure that I have the honor of chairing this plenary session 12 at our 4th annual Aquinas Leadership International World Congress, because it's devoted to remembering John and Deely as our colleague and friend and philosophical reformer. And I'm especially pleased to be able to have with us to present Brian Kemple, who was a student of John at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, and did his doctoral dissertation under John Deely, which is no mean achievement, being the only person ever successfully to achieve that activity. And Christopher Morrissey was going to be here also to present the paper on John. As Chris has said to me several times, we miss him immensely. We all loved him. He was one of these great souls, one of God's great ideas, just like Max Weisman and Matthew Mangini, Michael Novak. And also lived by his own rules. And he lived, yes, he lived, he was somewhat, it's like Frank Sinatra. So we have the benefit of Brian knowing a good deal about John. And also being able to understand the writings of Chris Morrissey better than anybody else that I probably can do it now. So he's going to begin his presentation with speaking first about John, and then Chris Morrissey's presentation regarding John Deely on logic as a liberal art, and then his own paper on sophists and semioticians. Brian?
Well, thank you all for continuing to be here, as this conference begins to wind down at the last day. Thank you very much to Dr. Redpath for inviting me to give this presentation. It's my first year here at the Congress in Huntington, and it's been a truly remarkable experience. You go to many conferences, and oftentimes I would find myself just sort of drifting off and thinking about my own thing, and you sit in a paper that's maybe a little dry, a little boring, and the questions afterwards are a little pedantic and perhaps not all that interesting, whereas I've been riveted the entire time that I've been here. Most importantly to me, I think in terms of seeing the value of this conference, is how many new ideas I've had generated over the past couple days, to the point that I've actually revised my paper about 6 or 7 times since I got here. That being said, what was initially, an 8-page paper is now a bunch of chicken scratch on a couple of pages. So we'll have to see just how that goes. So as Dr. Redpath mentioned, I'd like to begin with just a few remarks on John Deely. When I went to graduate school, or when I was looking into graduate schools, my undergraduate professor, Dr. Herbert Hartman, who some of you might know, who taught at Thomas Aquinas College in California for a long time, and was at Southern Catholic College, where I went as undergraduate, and is now at the Catholic University of America. Dr. Hartman told me that, John Deely is an interesting fellow, and if you can get past his attempts to shock you, you can learn more from him than anyone else at the Center for Thomistic Studies. While I learned an awful lot from pretty much everyone at the Center for Thomistic Studies, it was ultimately true that I learned the most from John Deely. This began in my second semester there, where I took his course on human nature, in which we read his book, Intentionality and Semiotics, which I believe is in some ways perhaps the best introduction to John Deely's thought, if you're trying to find an accessible way, particularly from a Thomist background, of entry into what he thinks. And it was during the course of that semester that Deely, as he often did, made a sort of off-the-cuff remark in discussing what Thomas means by saying that being is the first object of the intellect. He said that, well, I think that he said that the only book I know of which is an extended reflection on what Thomas means by being as the first object of the intellect is Martin Heidegger's Being and Time. And this was fascinating to me. I spent almost my entire senior year of undergraduate struggling with Heidegger's Being and Time, reading it over and over again, and thinking that I had understood it, only to open it up again and realize that I hadn't. So I asked John Deely if we could do an independent study on Heidegger. And he agreed, and we would meet regularly over breakfast, was seemingly his favorite meal of the day, as he loved Belgian waffles. And we would meet and discuss, and that paper became ultimately the basis for my dissertation, which I would write with him over the next several years. Yeah, so we'll come back to John at the end, because I know several others of you in here knew him fairly well also. And so being such a large personality, there are endless stories and anecdotes which we can tell. And as we go through, particularly in my presentation, I have a number of points that I want to emphasize that were points that Deely himself emphasized, points that I think we need to pay close attention to in our day and age. Okay, so now, just very briefly though, before I get to Chris Morrissey's paper, because he uses a fair amount of technical terminology, and over the last few days in discussing with some people, semiotics is very linguistic, terminologically heavy. It uses a lot of terminology, and quite often it's not explained in the course of using that terminology what those terms mean. So just very basically, there are three key terms that I'd like to define succinctly. The first is semiosis. Semiosis being simply the use of signs, the way in which one thing makes use of another in order to understand or connect with or be related to some third. Semiosis, Deely held, taking this from Charles Peirce, is an activity which pervades the entire universe. Everything operates, insofar as it operates, except perhaps with the exception of the divine, through a process of semiosis. Okay. Then in distinction to that is semiotics. Instead of semiosis, S-I-S at the end, we have T-I-C-S. Semiotics is the study of the action of signs. And this is unique to human beings. This is, as Deely goes to some length in explaining in Semiotic Animal, this is the real key distinction between human being animals and all other animals. It's in essence what thinkers like Thomas Aquinas and others mean when they define human being as a rational animal. And, going all the way back to Aristotle is defining human beings as the animal having speech or having logos. So semiotics, the study of the action of signs. Well, now just very briefly, the key word there, of course, is sign. What is a sign? There's actually a series of, or perhaps it's even condensed into one now, but there's a YouTube video in which a couple of actors perform a dialogue that John Deely wrote called What is a Sign? So if you want to go to YouTube, you type in What is a Sign, John Deely, you get that dialogue. I think it's about an hour long or so. Profoundly informative and written with a sort of tongue-in-cheek wit and occasional bad puns, as John Deely was quite prone to do. So a sign, very succinctly defined, and we can return to this definition in questions later on if we so choose. But a sign is the irreducibly triadic mediation accomplished by a relation between a fundament and a terminus. That is, it's not one thing standing for another, but it's actually the completed action of one thing being mediated in relation to some other. So in other words, relation is very key to understanding what a sign is. A sign isn't a thing. It's not the stop sign that you see on the street corner. But a sign is the accomplished action which is mediated by that stop sign. So the sign, most essentially, is determined, or rather constituted, by relation. It's not a thing in itself in the way that we conventionally think of things, but it is a relation. Okay, so with that little preface out of the way, I will do my best to proceed through Dr. Morrissey's paper. Unfortunately, you know, it's a shame he isn't here because I have several questions that I would love to ask him. But I will try my best to get through here. Okay, so John Deely's Magisterial Basics of Semiotics has been translated into 10 languages: English, Portuguese, Romanian, Japanese, Spanish, Ukrainian, Italian, Estonian, Chinese, and Russian, and has gone through 9 editions. Around the time when Deely first wrote that classic book, he was also working continuously on a manuscript that reconsidered the whole subject matter of logic from within the basic viewpoint of semiotics. Only recently did I read that manuscript, titled Logic as a Liberal Art, as I prepared it for publication at his request. The other works that Deely published in his lifetime have shaped my intellectual development in decisive ways. And now I am hoping his soon-to-be published work in logic will not only do the same for others, but also help to guide the future trajectory of liberal arts education. Just incidentally, for those of you who are unaware, John Deely published, I believe, 26 books in his lifetime, co-authored or edited over 30 as well, and then published in excess of 200 articles. It's almost hard to keep track of just what he wrote and when and where because he was so prolific. 2 key insights that I, meaning Chris Morrissey, learned from those other works of Deely have profoundly changed my way of thinking. The first key insight concerns the primary modeling system, which in humans is language, and should be distinguished from linguistic communication, which is really a secondary modeling system that is enabled by the primary. This primary modeling system, language in Tom Sebeck's idiosyncratic terminology, is also called nous or intellectus in the Greek and Latin philosophical traditions. The second key insight concerns the active intellect, that aspect of intellectus which adds a formal relation of identity to any object of consciousness, allowing it to be known as both an object and as a thing. This distinction between object and thing is one which Deely appropriated from the tradition of Jacques Maritain and more remotely from John Ponceau, that something which is an object is not necessarily a thing, such as all fictitious notions that we have are objects of our consciousness. They are thrown against, as the literal etymology of the Latin word tells us, thrown against our awareness, and so they become objects, but they aren't things in and of themselves. However, when we add this formal relation of identity to an object, we can see that something is not just an object, but is in fact also a thing as well, that it has its own nature, it has its own properties, it has its own existence. Now, this latter possibility, that is, of something being known as both an object and a thing, this latter possibility is what makes possible the logical cognition of the semiotic animal, whereby we humans are capable of a species-specific sort of syntactic thought in which, on the most fundamental level of our species-specific rationality, we can distinguish subjects, which are posited as things, from predicates, which are the objects of our knowledge of subjects. I would say the most important thing to notice about the relation between subjects and predicates is the asymmetrical relation within which they stand. It is this asymmetry, known as such, that is intelligible only to the semiotic animal. This very asymmetry is that which makes distinctively logical reasoning possible. The behavior of other animals may be termed logical insofar as it follows a definite rationale and pattern that aims to ensure survival. I would say, just to interject here for a moment, that we often see animals behave in ways which we would consider logical because they are rational. And there's this tendency in the sort of lack of the proper human distinction which emerges in modernity to show that that's simply, or use that as simply a difference of degree rather than a difference of kind in terms of the sort of cognitive behavior which goes on in other animals and in human beings. But only the human, as the semiotic animal, is able to know how rational or irrational any behavior is, and to interrogate its thoughts and subject them to the process of critical control of objectivity by the sort of reasoning that alone is self-consciously logical. Okay. So I have been able to build further on the key insights communicated to me by Deely. Specifically, I've come to realize how the logical process of immediate inference, known traditionally as syllogistic reasoning, is governed by only one semiotic rule, known as the dictum de omni et malo. That is the maxim of all and none, that whatever is affirmed or denied of the whole genus may be affirmed or denied of any of the members of the species or any of the species. So the classic example being, the perfect syllogism of three universal affirmatives, that all dogs are mammals, all mammals have livers, so therefore all dogs have livers. And you could do the same with a negative series of propositions as well. Okay. So this dictum de omni et malo is best understood as a description of the semiosis by which semiotic animals, aware of the semiosic process, are able to assess the validity of their semiotic inferences. The other rules of inference, traditionally understood to govern the syllogism, are then able to be better understood, namely, precisely as rules of syntax governing the application of this one fundamental semiotic rule of inference. Nobody asked me about that because that's what I wanted to ask Chris about. One way I like to explain the operation of the dictum de omni et nullo is by making an analogy involving model train sets. This analogy of mine is an update to the analogy of Lego building blocks previously used by Susan Petrelli and Augusto Ponzio. Petrelli and Ponzio rightly credit Semiotic with the insight that while the function of linguistic communication is to transmit messages or to give information, the species-specific function of language does not. And so now there's this lengthy quote here from Petrelli and Ponzio. Okay. Semiotic described language as a primary modeling device. Every species is endowed with a model that produces its own world, and language is the name of the model that belongs to human beings. However, as a modeling device, human language is completely different from the modeling devices of other life forms. Its distinctive feature is what the linguists call syntax, that is, the capacity to order single elements on the basis of operational rules. But while for linguists, these elements are the words, phrases, and sentences, etc., of historical natural languages, Sebioc's reference was to a mute syntax. Thanks to syntax, human language, understood not as a historical natural language, but as a modeling device, is similar to Lego building blocks. It can resemble a limited number of construction pieces in an infinite number of different ways. As a modeling device, language can produce an indefinite number of models. In other words, the same pieces can be taken apart and put together to construct an infinite number of different models. Therefore, we can see, that's the end of the quote, therefore, we can see how for Sebioc, biosemiotics, that is the study of semiotics specifically in reference to life, is the discipline that discerns what is unique to the modeling system of each species. For humans, it is language understood in the root sense as a mute syntax. I think another way that you might be able to address that is something as a speculative grammar, but we can get into that later if need be. While still appreciating the modeling process of semiosis as a phenomenon common to all living things. Okay? So yes, pardon me. I interrupted in the middle of a sentence to make a comment and then lost the train of thought in the sentence. Let me repeat the sentence. We can see how for Sebioc, biosemiotics is the discipline that discerns what is unique to the modeling system of each species, while still appreciating the modeling process of semiosis as a phenomenon common to all living things. In the case of humans, we uniquely rely on an implicit awareness of the syntax of mediated inference, which is what the dictum de omni et nullo expresses. Namely, we can colligate premises by connecting them with middle terms according to the one valid pattern. This is where I'd like to say that Chris really ought to be here because now he has symbolic constructions in his paper. So essentially, it's the structure of the standard syllogism of a subject term plus a middle term, perhaps another middle term, or however many middle terms we want, and then an ultimate predicate, right? Which he has collocated one after the other in the model of a train set up on a track. I could hold it up to the camera, so at least some people out there can see what's going on. I don't know if he's planning on using the board or having slides or what have you, so we'll just barrel on through down these train tracks. So the engine comes first, followed by the boxcars that have to be connected in the proper order, and then it finishes with the caboose at the end. If we connect the components of the train any other way, then the dictum de omni et nullo cannot cancel out the middle boxcars, which must be arranged by the one valid pattern required in order for the dictum to be applied. If you have your middle terms in the wrong order, you're not going to be able to collapse the syllogism into a unity. So if the dictum can be applied, then the proper colligation of the components of our argument, that is the proper colligation of the engine, boxcars, and caboose, will have prepared us for drawing the valid inference possible from that proper preparation of our train of thought, that is the unity of subject and predicate. What John Deely envisioned as the semiotic task of logic as a liberal art thereby comes into view. What he called validation will consist of the mind playing with mental train sets in order to colligate trains of thought from which the dictum may draw valid inferences. There are many ways to connect trains of thought, but the one fundamental rule of inference, known as the dictum de omni et nullo, is what governs how the inner boxcars may be validly connected. There are other rules of inference, but they simply amount to the syntax of the proper equivalences, that is, the immediate inferences, that we may use when manipulating the components of our mental train sets. But this manipulation should always be conducted with the task of validation in view, that is, the eventual resolution of the colligated premises, the train of thought, by means of the application of the dictum into a valid conclusion. So my train set analogy, as a refinement of the Lego building blocks analogy, thus aims to illustrate how the human intellect, which is species-specifically capable of the sort of manipulation that always has the task of validation by the dictum in view. My train set analogy implicitly has the primary modeling system capability that enables the semiotic knowledge of mediate inference that governs the dictum's deployment in the species-specifically characteristic syntactic manipulations of humans. In my forthcoming book, titled The Way of Logic, I show how the 24 traditionally valid moods of the Aristotelian syllogism can be understood as the primary modeling system's manipulation of cognition, according to the fundamental semiotic syntax that I've just discussed above. My book thus builds on the work of Deely's Logic as a Liberal Art, which has reconsidered the whole subject matter of logic from within the basic point of view of semiotics, a task which had never really been taken up before, even though key developments in the history of semiotics have always taken place in the context of studies in logic, as with John Ponso's 1632 Tractatus de Signis, which Deely famously published in a 1985 bilingual edition, and which was released in 2013 in a second and updated edition. The manuscript of Deely's own logic book remained unfinished in his lifetime due to the incomplete state of the final chapter, which lacked explicit rules for the task, innovatively highlighted by Deely, the task of semiotic validation, namely the logical analysis of an invalid argument so as to make explicit the valid consequences it actually contains. My solution to this problem raised by Deely in his manuscript, which is now being published posthumously as the book Logic as a Liberal Art, is given at length in my own book, which I am drawing upon here, in order to share my key insight with you briefly in this short paper. As Deely suggested, the solution to the art of validation, would have to be derived from a comprehensively semiotic understanding of the syllogism's characteristic rules of inference. But because of the semiotic nature of human thought, there actually is no single ironclad algorithmic way of seeking validation for any particular train of thought. Instead, the semiotic process of validation is a process elegantly enabled by one basic rule, the rule of immediate inference, the dictum de omni et nihilo, which is then governed by a logical syntax of derivation, the list of immediate inferences or equivalences, that is in accord with this basic rule. What makes all of this demonstrable is the discovery by Fred Summers of the, quote, surprising, though not very well known empirical fact that the familiar logical words we use in everyday deductive reasoning behave in a natural language like English in the way that plus and minus signs behave in algebra and arithmetic. Exploiting the plus-minus character of the natural logical constants gives us a logical language whose formulas are transcriptions, not translations, of the sentences that figure in logical reasoning, end quote. In using this discovery by Summers, the main contribution that I aim to make with my own book is to show how logic helps semiotics by revealing the structural asymmetry between subject and predicate, which is something that can ultimately only be understood fully from the semiotic animal's point of view. That is, from a semiotic understanding of logical semiosis. My hope is that by deepening our semiotic understanding of logical semiosis, future education in the art of logic will be guided in its presentation of the fundamental rules of inference in order to make logical thought easier by articulating the rules of inference with a semiotically aware logic. The ultimate outcome would then be the realization of one of John Deely's fondest hopes, that is, the restoration of logic's rightful place in education as a liberal art. Okay, so if you have any questions now, it might actually be easier to answer them than go through my presentation. And as I said, I'll do the best I can. I could probably do a lot better had I read Chris Morrissey's book, but I haven't. So, yeah, if any, John?
Yeah. I'm very interested in science.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a very fertile kind of topic. And I'm just wondering, do you have any idea of what, almost like the final cause of why he picked sign as a subject to look at?
Are you asking about John Daly?
Yeah, the first part, the first thing you read.
Okay. Well, I think
his definition, accomplished action mediated by a.
I see. Oh, so that was my definition that I gave. Yes.
Definition actually of the sign.
Thank you.
I think it's a very important concept, especially when you think of like environmental things and all that.
Oh yeah. I think there's an almost limitless value in semiotics in terms of explaining the sacraments and also in engaging in Trinitarian theology. You know, when Thomas talks about the persons of the Trinity, right, he does so describing them as relations, and that they are in a certain way, almost as it were, signs to each other, and the way that we understand them is signs of a certain greater whole. In terms of the definition of a sign as irreducibly triadic, this irreducibly triadic mediation accomplished by a relation between a fundament and a terminus. I think the reason that this is so important is quite simply that it's true, that anything that operates as a sign, and signs operate pervasively throughout the universe, does so in a way which is irreducibly triadic. Part of the difficulty in getting this across, and this will come up a bit in my own presentation momentarily, is that we've become so conditioned, even oftentimes implicitly and unconsciously ourselves as Thomists, to approach understanding of the world through the paradigms of realism versus idealism, and also the paradigms of empirometric science. That something like a relation doesn't appear immediately to us or evidently to us always as an object of our own cognition. we're not aware to the extent that we are dealing cognitionally on a day-to-day basis with relations themselves. And so making clear that relations are distinct from the things related is a complicated task that, you know, I'm almost ashamed at how bad I explain it in person, given that it's the subject of the entire 5th chapter of my dissertation. I really ought to be better than I am at explaining it.
I remember reading Norris Clark's, you know, what was it? Being in Existence. Being in Existence.
Person and being.
Person and being.
Right.
Person and being. And he talked about how being is relation.
Well, right. One of Norris Clark's insights there, and Norris Clark was also friends with John Deely. He has a very interesting reflection that's published in the American Journal of Semiotics in, I think it was 2005. They did a 2005, 2004 maybe. They did a panel discussing Deely's 4 ages of understanding. Yeah. So you should recall, and I actually found I found Norris.
Being is good. When you think about God, he doesn't have parts, yet he has relations, and it's the way he is. And
right.
So love is, you know, relational and all that. It's just some kind of fascinating topic.
Yeah, yeah, and I found very helpful in initially understanding Deely's work, Norris Clark's description of a sort of two-way intentionality, right? That not only is there an intentionality of our concepts or the way in which we understand things, but all things insofar as they are being are intentional as well. That to be is to be in communication, that they are, Deely often liked to quote then Cardinal Ratzinger in his 1970 Introduction to Christianity, where Ratzinger says that, you know, the age of the sort of undivided sway of thinking in terms of substance is at an end, and that we now see that relation is equiprimordial with substance in existence.
And to add what you just said, I up with a question of perhaps only in God there is this sign. I would say that going back to the definition, that a sign makes another known, right? So Christ is a sign of the Father, because whoever knows me knows the Father. But I want to ask a question around. You mentioned a symmetry at some point, and I'm not sure I understood that part.
Yeah, this is in Morrissey's paper here. He talks about the asymmetrical relation of subject and predicate, which is exemplified in this dictum de omni et nullo, right? That the subject of a predication is, in some sense, lesser in its extension than the predicate, right? That the predicate must be broader.
Okay, I see. Because, and here's exactly why it interests me. Asymmetry, properly speaking, would be to be incommensurate. Like the point is incommensurate with the line, or as we would say in modern mathematics, you can't divide by 0, right? So of course the predicate is the relation between predicate and form is like the predicate and subject is like the relation between form and matter, right? And form and matter have to be proportional, right? So I understand what you're saying, and it's just a term that was confusing, but
no,
it brings me to the it's perfectly okay. I understand. So you're saying one is larger than the other, or contains the other, and that's where I was going next. That the whole terminology of the syllogism in Aristotle and in St. Thomas and all the tradition is, if you look at Archias, his theory of proportion, which is the theory of means in music. He also has, of course, a greater term. A is greater than B, and B is greater than C, and there's a relationship between A and B, and B and C, which determines the analogy or the proportion, which can be arithmetic proportion, or geometric proportion, or harmonic proportion. So something similar happens and I'm pretty sure that Aristotle would base whole terminology on mathematics, which made it a lot easier to transition to logic, in which the major term contains the middle term, and the middle term contains the minor term, which is pretty much, you know, how subject predicate works. So there also an analogy, if you like, because there's a relation between, you know, from the premises to the conclusion. There are relationships that tie into the two premises to the conclusion. And the director just asked if I consider that to be virtual quantity. And definitely, you know, it is virtual quantity. It's logos as well, analogia, which I find very interesting because you mentioned the plus and the minus in algebra and everything. And yeah, that's absolutely right.
Validation would appear to occur through induction.
Yeah, yeah. Now, this is again one of those unfortunate consequences of Chris not being here. Part of the discussion of validation, I talked about this, I believe, once with Deely, is just sort of in passing. We were having a conversation about Charles Peirce and his use of the term musement. Right? Charles Peirce likes to use the term musement, a play of musement, in a way of thinking things through in order to arrive at a valid induction. Right? To be able to just sort of let your mind meander through different ideas. The chief application that Peirce makes of this is in his neglected argument for the reality of God, one of his later works, I think, written in 1908, where he talks about how through simply allowing your mind to ponder all of the mysteries that are present in the universe, you eventually arrive at what seems like a very compelling argument, a valid argument, a validated argument for the understanding of God.
By the way, did he have something to say about propositional logic? You know, how he viewed the propositional logic? Because I mean, when we're speaking about terms and all that, and just kind of leave them out.
Yeah, you know, I've flipped through once the manuscript of this now being posthumously published work of Deely's, The Logic as a Liberal Art. And I do believe there's a section towards the beginning on propositional logic before he gets into his treatment of syllogisms. You know, I can't really speak to this with much authority. I wish I could, but there we have it. Yeah, Terry.
What's the title of Chris's book?
Good question. I just have to figure out what page. The Way of Logic. Yeah, The Way of Logic. Yeah.
Could you give me a definition of what semiotics is?
Yeah, it's almost hard to give a really, you either give a one-sentence definition or you give a 200-page book definition. So my preferred succinct definition is the study of the action of signs. And so how signs act or how they operate or what the actuality of signs is. So the study of the action of signs, which is a behavior unique to human beings. And that's what part of what Chris was talking about with logical semiotics, right? The logical consideration. Yes.
So no one involved in semiotics thinks that animals are irrational.
Oh, well, talking about people in semiotics, I think you'll find people in semiotics who believe anything. Yeah. There is no one concise school of semiotics. Yeah, it's a diverse crowd, part of which I think is just by the fact that it's very much internationally dispersed. You know, aside from the school in Estonia at the University of Tartu, I don't know of any real dedicated full-time centers of semiotic thinking.
You find that railroad model in Hobbes at the beginning of the London Leviathan, talking about the sign of spaniel ranges the field, and it does not have a systematic sign in the sense of having a passionate type of organization. Gore is going from sensation to perception, right? And reinterpreting Aristotle in this kind of linear fashion. So semiotics, to a certain extent, goes back to Locke
Aquinas.
Mm.
So a lot of people in the field come at it from that angle.
Right, and then there's also in general in Europe what's often been called semiotics actually really is what has later been called semiology, right? Developing out of the work of Ferdinand de Saussure.
The second part of your part,
Mhm.
you brought it up. Are you going to go back to Peirce's argument on the neglect argument?
No, but that can certainly come up in the conversation. Yeah, it is a good segue. I have one question though. He's had his hand up for the last 5 minutes. So.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask. My intellect nous, the ancient intellect then, of course, would be the nous poeticos. I don't know if I'm totally wrong. Is that correct?
I believe so. I'm not quite sure what the whole context of what Chris was doing with correlation.
I'm just wondering if there's a bit of harmony maybe between the idea of semiotics itself and poetics.
Oh, absolutely. There's actually a lot of application, particularly in the Tartu and Moscow school of semiotics. Where there's a lot of poetic analysis. You find in Yuri Lotman, for instance, he quite frequently uses poetry to make his points. And a lot of that actually develops at also, Mikhail Bakhtin was a sort of precursor to the Russian semiotics movement. But okay, well now I will segue into my own presentation on sophists and semioticians. And as I said, I've had so many ideas being here that this might come across as a little scattered. And I'm kind of hopeful that through what I say, either through some spark of nous or through your questions, that I can maybe condense this back down into a more intelligible format. Fortunately, it's being recorded, and so I can go back and listen and see what egregious mistakes I make in the course of this discussion. So I'll just very briefly, part of the inspiration for this presentation on sophists and semioticians is that about a little over a year ago, I moved from the graduate program in Houston, where it was at least thoroughly Catholic or Christian environment, to the godless city of Boston, where through my employment and in my social circles, I've actually found myself associating with a large number of rather godless people, many of whom are highly educated, who've been working in the sciences and especially in psychology.
But they're not watching this.
They're not watching this. No, I didn't tell them to look at this. I'm going to do a little venting. No. And so, not that all of these people are sophists as such.
Oh, they're Red Sox.
But there is an awful lot of sophistry at work in their thinking, in the universities that are there, and in the day-to-day conversations that I unfortunately can't seem to help but overhear. So just with an opening of a question that we've all heard and to which we all have an answer, question, well, what is a sophist? And the clearest, easiest definition is someone who is a pretender to wisdom, someone who pretends that they have ultimate principles which are to be relied upon for guiding the conduct of intellectual inquiry and for the conduct of life. Now, this is one of those pet points, linguistic points, terminological points that John Daly often liked to make, is that what we often today call postmodernism is not in any meaningful sense postmodern, because it has not in any meaningful sense moved beyond the fundamental philosophical presuppositions of modernity. So rather than speaking of postmoderns and what are typically called postmoderns today, particularly those who have developed their thought in the Marxist line of understanding and the critical theory school of Frankfurt, rather than call them postmodernists, they're better called, as John Daly suggested, ultra-modernists, because they really have gone to the extreme consequences of modernity's first principles. Nevertheless, there are still many people today who more properly fall into the mold of modernism, who are modernists. For these modernists, these modern sophists, wisdom, they claim, is what's found in empirometric science. Now, this is quite clear with the positivists, but it still persists even in those who've followed the work of Popper and of Thomas Kuhn. There's still this idea that science is the highest form of knowledge that we can attain, and that it is what ought to be directing or guiding our country, our lives, and what have you. In contrast, the ultramodernist claims that there is no wisdom. There are only theories and experiences, and theories based on experiences, and you choose your theory based on how well it meshes with your experience, and you are perhaps wise in the conduct of your own life, but that wisdom has no bearing on the lives of any others. Which makes it very hard to have a conversation with an ultramodernist. But the common root of these two contemporary sophisms running rampant in our society, it's sad to say that despite being sophists, they are the ones who have been directing our culture for quite a long time. The common root is this presupposition, uncritically adopted in modernity, that our ideas are the proper and direct objects of our knowledge. Or perhaps if you wanted to reduce it to a single word, you would call it nominalism. Now, Deely's definition of nominalism, at least the one that he came to adopt in later days, since there are so many varieties of nominalism throughout the history of philosophy, what's common to all of them is this belief that relations outside of the mind either do not exist or cannot be known, which is functionally the same thing, that we cannot know a relation outside of our mind. So as a consequence of this, whatever concepts we have, we can never be certain or even confident that they replicate in a meaningful way the reality independent of us. In a sense, this is the heart of idealism. This is why even the empiricists in the modern tradition are idealists ultimately, because they take from Descartes uncritically this presupposition that ideas are our objects of knowledge. Okay, and so this has just dramatic and profound consequences that perhaps are not so immediately evident so long as I think a Christian sentiment remained in the Western world, because even though that was no longer a rational thing, even though Christianity was no longer something that could be, say, demonstrated or proven or argued for in a rational context, the sentiment of the West remained Christian up until, at least for the majority of the population, up until really the last century, towards the end of the last century, when this seemingly precipitous decline of Christian sentiment in our country began to occur. I really think that, speaking of technology as we so often have these last few days, that the internet is, in a sense, not necessarily to blame for that, but it has been an engine used in driving that destruction. And if anyone's interested, I can maybe speak more to that either after the talk or at dinner or when we go out on the town. But I think the real problem that we're experiencing today, and I see this with my students, for those of you who I've not talked to yet this weekend, I'm currently teaching at the Wentworth Institute of Technology, which is a relatively small school in Boston, very career-oriented, and does a very good job in a sort of vocational training. But many of their students, many of the majors require that the students take ethics. And so what I've observed over the last 3 semesters in teaching, roughly fairly small classes, maybe 100 students that I've had so far, is that there's a sort of soft and implicit nihilism, which they've all accepted, that there is no meaning in the world outside of their own subjective valuations. That teleology is something that if it exists, exists only by human imposition. that there are no such things as natures, which is a, you know, obviously a long-standing sort of problem, but that this not only are there no natures that can be known, but because of that, there's no meaning to anything really in their lives. And the one thing where I found this is most perhaps shockingly evident is in teaching or discussing sexuality. It's amazing to me how you know, I mean, it's a school of mostly men, it's an engineering school, it's about 80-20 male to female ratio. Students, you know, 18 to 23, 24 years old generally. And they're really not that interested in sex, which, I mean, in a sense, that's almost shocking, right? How many young 20-year-old men are not that interested in sex? Which isn't to say that they're not interested in having it, but they're not that interested in thinking about it or in it being an integral part of their lives. It's decreasing as an aspect or an element of relationships. It's becoming the case that as they conceive sexuality, it is more and more and more a function of fantasy, that they spend their time thinking about it in terms of the pleasure that they receive from it. And because it's just a matter of pleasure, like all things which are pleasurable, it becomes less interesting over time. It's no different to them than going to the movies. And, you know, this, I think, again, speaking of the internet, has a lot to do with pornography consumption. It's perhaps one of the more depressing things to encounter that some of the websites now put out statistics, pornography websites put out statistics. One of the most popular websites had 64 million views per day in 2016. That's just one website, right? 64 million views per day. And so, you know, it's quite obvious, it seems quite obvious to me that what they're seeing there, because it's so different from what you would receive in any relationship, good, bad, or otherwise, that there's this increasing separation between the activity and the personal unitive aspect of sex. And it's very sad to say that this does receive a profound and consistent normalization from these supposedly scientific fields like in sex research. You know, Kinsey and Masters and Johnson were not the end of that, and it's still quite prevalent today, and it's a big issue. And as I mentioned, you know, a lot of the people I've been talking to in Boston were involved in psychology. I mean, there's a lot of that research that goes on there. And so these sexual deviances and these notions of altered, perhaps non-normative sexual identity are consistently being reinforced through these studies, through these statistical normalizations. You know, oh, you know, we interviewed so many people and they all said that they are into this or that, or this different, you know, deviant ideal or what have you. And, you know, that obviously goes back quite a ways. I was actually, I don't watch a lot of TV, but when I do, there's a channel in Boston that shows nothing but old game shows. It's actually my favorite channel, right? So there's one, maybe some of you remember it, Tattletales, in which they would have celebrity couples on and they would talk about, you know, all of these sort of intimate details of their lives. And so I can't remember who it was. I think it was actually William Shatner was asked the question, would you be more upset by your wife thinking about another man while kissing you, or by your wife kissing another man while thinking of you? Right? And so I think it may not have been Shatner, but I know he's on there regularly, so it just sort of fits too. He said, citing the latest book in sexual research, that, well, it's shown that nearly everyone at some point or another time fantasizes about someone other than the person that they're with. That this is just sort of a normal thing that human beings do, that we think about someone else while we're intimate with with our spouses or significant others. And so he just, you know, said this, like, it's just the most normal thing in the world right now for people to do this. The sad fact of the matter is that might really be true, that everyone at some point or another does, or maybe not everyone, but a large number of people some point or another do fantasize about someone else. But there's this attitude of, oh, well, that's just okay, right? That's just what everyone does. And so, you know, that's obviously a bit of an aside. And I'm definitely preaching to the choir here. I'm sure when I say that it's, you know, this normalization through scientific studies, through scientific research, has pervaded every aspect of culture. Another question that I frequently ask my students is, I ask them what they think the percentage of people who identify as LGBT plus whatever, what the percentage is. What? So the full acronym is about 2/3 of the alphabet now. So I just sort of do the first 4 letters and then the plus. At any rate, I asked them this question, and invariably, unless there's a few people who've actually seen the studies, the majority of them say 20 to 30%. When I point out to them that the most liberal estimates put it at under 3%, they're all shocked. They've never heard that before. And so it's, but if you think about it, if you turn on your average sitcom today, there's probably 4 or 5 main characters, and at least one of them is non-heterosexual, right? Who has some different sexual identity. So this is where I'm starting to get particularly scattered. Part of the normalization process, right, is this continued agenda of saying that everything's socially constructed. Right? There's the continued rise of social constructivism. Part of this, I think, deals with, or comes from, rather, the contemporary cult of neuroscience, the contemporary cult of neuroscience and cognitive science, that through modern scientific methods, we can understand precisely how and what the concepts we form are by looking at the brain. The sort of mantra of people in these fields is, as Steven Pinker put it in his 1997 book, that the title just went right out of my head. No. I can't remember. It'll come back to me later. But he says that, you know, the mind is what the brain does. And this is just sort of taken over and believed to be true, even though there's really no evidence that that's exactly what's going on when we talk about what we mean by mind. So this cult of neuro and cognitive science shows supposedly that, you know, our concepts are constructed through various different neurological pathways, right? That either it has something to do with embodied cognition, that is, that our concepts are basically some form of sense memory of different physical interactions that we've had with the world around us, or that perhaps it's located in an abstracted semantic model, or semantic memory, such that a higher order is achieved, but what that higher order is, they never really say, I think because they have the wrong principles. But what follows from this, what's consistently portrayed in all of these, you know, scientific, neuroscientific studies, is that concepts are constructs that we produce in order to make sense of our experience in the world. That a concept is nothing more than that. A concept doesn't relate to you any meaning except insofar as something is experienced by you. All it conveys to you is the meaning of the experience that you've had. And so I think this profoundly reinforces the social constructivism that we see. It allows people to argue that, well, you know, heterosexual identity is not in any sense a norm. It's just been the most common experience that most people have had. And so that's why that concept seems normal, is just because of its commonality. Coextensively with this, I think there's a tendency to consider the universe according to what has been termed a pan-informational paradigm. That is, that the universe can be broken down into ultimate bits of information. And that when we break things down into information and say that that's all that's there, you know, a lot has been said this weekend about organization. Well, I think for the sophists of our day, organization is a product either of random chance or of human artifice. That there is no such thing as a natural organization. Right? And consequently, there's only, as I mentioned before, a human or at least animal-imposed teleology of things. So I think that sort of wraps up what I have to say about sophists. Well, now what is a semiotician? That's definitely a harder question to answer. Right? There's a plurality of semiotic approaches that can be taken in virtually any discipline. But I think one characteristic which is true of at least all of the semioticians who take Charles Peirce as their starting point is that there's a search for cohesion. There's a search to see things not ever as parts of totally disparate spheres of experience or of the universe, but to see everything as somehow fitting together. Peirce gives a name to this. He calls it cynicism, not cynicism, cynicism. And it's an interesting but underdeveloped idea in Peirce's own writing. So in this search for cohesion, in the search for looking for a way to bring all of our experiences together in a systematic and cohesive way, this is where I return to relation, because I think it's the most crucial factor in understanding how the universe is cohesive, how the universe is coherent. Now, for those of you who are familiar with Deely's work, I'm sure you're well aware of how often he talked about the importance of esse ad, that is, being towards, in its equiprimordial status as a mode of existence with sem, or substantial being. This insight, I think, initially occurred to John in his early days, actually. He wrote his doctoral dissertation on Heidegger, a wonderful little book, which really did help me to understand Heidegger, to come back to that point, called The Tradition via Heidegger, in which he described the key moment of insight actually coming from reading Jacques Maritain's Degrees of Knowledge. In struggling to figure out what precisely Heidegger means by Dasein, by being there, what Deely came to the conclusion of, and I think this is basically true, is that Dasein is the same as, in a sense, esse intentionale, as intentional being, as the being towards of things. And that really the best way to translate Dasein, even though it's not at all a literal translation, is the intentional life of human beings, or perhaps intentionality perfused life of human beings. So understanding that this notion that the universe is in as much as it exists, it also exists in communication, it exists intentionally, it exists in being towards things. It's curious that for how much Heidegger talks about relation, he never talks about relation, or hardly ever. There's one small section of Being in Time which is dedicated to what relations are. And the vast majority of it, he's talking relationally, which is evidenced by the fact that almost every other phrase seems to have a preposition in it. You're being for something, being with something, being alongside, being towards, especially, I think is quite crucial. But I think perhaps one way, since the full topic of relation is quite extensive, and as I said, I struggle to give a real accurate, succinct description of it. I think perhaps the easiest way to get at its importance is to go back to that issue of meaning. I said that the modern sophists and the ultra-modern sophists alike have stripped our world of meaning by stripping our sort of or by adopting this nominalistic position which denies that relations outside of the mind can be known. And so it's always interesting to me that we use the word meaning in two distinct but intimately related senses. That we talk about meaning as the intelligibility of something, of what something is. We talk about meaning in terms of quiddity. And then we also talk about meaning in terms of a teleological significance that something possesses, particularly when we talk about something being meaningful to you or having meaning for you. This sense of teleological ordination, this is one which is just ubiquitously denied in modernity, that we can know with any sort of intellectual, rational conviction that things have a teleological ordination is something given up. Right? And I think this follows as a consequence of denying that we can get at the substances or the natures or at the meaning of things in themselves, so the meaning of things in terms of their intelligibility. If we reduce the meaning of things to what can be known by the methods of empirometric science, then we're not left with an awful lot of knowledge, right? Or even with empiricism. You know, when Locke says that the substance of a thing is an I know not what, right? He's giving up any sort of valid inference, valid induction, valid move beyond the mere sensory, beyond what can be empirically, strictly sensibly known. But I think if we simply open the door to seeing that we do in fact cognize relations, that relations are apprehended by us constantly, even though there's no physical data of the relation itself, I think this goes a long way to sort of overcoming this sophistry. You know, I try it here and there with my students to get them to see this. The easiest thing is that they all believe that there are relations, right? And it's sort of at a naive, common sense level. They all believe that there are relations, that they're really related to their parents. They really are in these relationships that they have with their friends and their significant others. And then I point out, as John Deely so often likes to do, that when that relation, when one of the terms of the relation is removed, the relation remains, but in a different way. Right? And moreover, when that relation ends or when it changes, it does so instantaneously. If your father dies right now, you know, that body ceases to be your father. Instantaneously. It doesn't have to travel across time or space for that to happen. It's not as though, you know, his death takes time to actually change the status of the relation. And so now if I can just run through one last thing real quickly. I think, you know, another topic which came up quite frequently was the idea of philosophy as a psychological habit. And I think that in order to get at that a little bit, you know, critical reflection is the means whereby we discern both of these senses of meaning. Right? We're talking about the meaning of the intelligibility of the thing and of its teleology. We do so not just by a simple reception of them. Right? We do need to engage in a discursive process, both at an intellectual level and most certainly at the level of the vis cogitativa. But what's really critical in engaging this critical reflection, what's crucial in engaging this critical reflection, is the use of second intentions, that is the use of logic. And so here's where there's a nice convenient dovetail with Chris's paper. You know, Thomas says in the De Trinitate, in question 6, article 1, the second part of the article in response to objection 3, that logic is the prerequisite to all science. That unless we have logic, unless we employ second intentions, that is, unless we see how our concepts are related to the things themselves, we can't have any science at all. Okay, and so I think practicing critical reflection, practicing the art of logic, is how we form that philosophical habit. I think that's how we can be assisted in disentangling the truth about the objects that we know, that we perceive, from our irrational emotional entanglements. We can gain clarity about what's really there, about that intelligibility sense of meaning, and consequently see the teleology that's involved. It allows us in seeing how we misunderstand or do truly understand our objects. And it's a habit, this critical, reflective, philosophical habit, is a habit to which semiotics is conducive on the one hand, and to which it brings further precision on the other. I think it allows us to better see the appropriate unities of the objects of our experience. You know, for instance, just clarifying the kinds of relations which we are present in the things of our experience. You know, thinking about something like sexuality, as I mentioned before, there's this profound disconnect between the pleasurable aspect, the unitive aspect, and the reproductive aspect, such that there's no longer any sense of sexuality as a whole in most people, in college students, it seems. And a large part of this is a sort of misapprehension of the unitive and reproductive aspects as merely incidental to the sexual activity, properly speaking. And so seeing what the relationship is, that it's really a property of sex, that it be at least potentially reproductive, and that it be, I think, in all cases where it's done for the right reasons with the right person at the right time, unitive in its function. I think there are lots of ways in which semiotics can help us to bear out the nature of the relations and the signs which we are perceiving or misperceiving in the way we go about forming these concepts, not just as individuals, but at the cultural level as a whole. Okay, so on that note, if anyone has any questions, if anyone has any suggestions, certainly about how I can clean that up and make it more streamlined. Yeah, Mark.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I came here last year on account of Deely. I'm really happy that I've met you and I'm learning much more about this that I'm happy to I never got to meet Deely personally. My question for you is, knowing him and being involved with his project, as they say, what do you believe John Deely is trying to accomplish, and how well did he do in the end? And I will qualify this by saying that I've read 10 books by Daly and lots of articles and so forth as a fraction of what he wrote. I don't feel I'm an expert on Daly by any means. I do feel I'm something of an expert on Marshall McLuhan. And the note that I sent to John Deely was to try to tie the two together, and that never happened. I believe that Marshall McLuhan's project was to help the Roman Catholic Church. I'm quite certain of that. And I'm also quite certain that he failed. What was John Deely's project, and how did he do?
Well, his project, I think, was to provide us a better understanding of the true nature of human beings. I think that was his ultimate concern with his work. Regardless of what he was writing on, that always seemed to be the central theme that he came back to. It's always what he was ultimately aiming at. And so I think, in a sense, even though it's one of his shorter books, Semiotic Animal might be sort of the point of the spear, as it were, in his project, in which he proposes this redefinition of human being from rational animal to semiotic animal, in a way where we not only are capable then of overcoming idealism and the faults of modernity, but we do so without perhaps relapsing into a defensive realism, where realism doesn't become simply about countering idealism, but realism is, I guess, maybe fructified into something perhaps a bit more than what you find with Gilson or Maritain. So this, with this re-foundation or this redefinition of human beings, and through the methods and models and insights of semiotics, as I said, the one real characteristic, I think, of all the truly good semioticians is a search for cohesion, search for a coherent account of life, the universe, and everything to a certain extent. Not that any one person can do that, but I think Deely wanted to prompt the rest of us to take up that work and to continue in that vein. Now, as for his success, he wasn't totally without success, but nor was he nearly as successful as he hoped he would be. Part of that, I think, is simply a rhetorical difficulty. Part of that is the difficulty of proposing challenging ideas that always take some time to be accepted. He would often say that he expected if he ever truly became famous, it wouldn't be for another 100, 150 years. Right? That for his ideas to be accepted, it would take well past his own lifetime. And so I think the success of his work, it falls on those of us who have come to know and appreciate John Deely's work for the value that it provides to philosophy and to whatever other disciplines in which it has an application. Yeah, that is.
Can you talk more about the sophistry and what it is that these unfortunate or victims of propaganda or miseducation are onto, or what's true about their, I think there's something true about what they're experiencing in their existential state, but they don't know how to describe it right. And once they try to describe it, they run into fallacies and sophistry. But if you just put that aside, right, aren't they really trying to say that you cannot get outside your own experience? You can't experience a supra-experiential reality outside of your own experience. You're in it. The world's in you, you're in the world. There's a kind of like sense that consciousness is a medium, and your consciousness is where the world is. It's kind of Heidegger, the world worlds, and it's here. It's in your intentionality of something. And they don't want some authoritative consciousness over here to tell them what their consciousness should look like, what they should be experiencing. And they know that your consciousness is no different than mine in the sense that we're both equally consciousnesses. We're both having experiences of something or other. They're resistant to have any social authority, cultural authority, impose something that's arbitrary on them. And so all they have left is, does what you're saying, what you're presenting, comport with how I'm experiencing things or not? That's really kind of true, isn't it? I mean, that's what philosophers do. We compare. We also have the sense that our experience of reality might not be quite full, or it might be distorted. We might have a lower level of consciousness. But in the end, we're going to have to assess any kind of theory, any kind of presentation, the contents of someone else's consciousness communicated to me. We're going to have to assess it and see if it comports with. So to me, like, maybe you can talk to these kids and say, yeah, you're right. This is all true. Subjectivity is real. It's a part of the real, The science is a part of subjectivity in a sense. But what they do is they have this normal, I think, experience, but they don't know how to talk about it. And once they start to talk about it, it goes into caricature relativism and ridiculous, dogmatic contradictions that they don't even know they're making, But I'm interested in what they're getting at.
No, what you say is spot on in many ways. And with my own students, I actually, in teaching ethics, I use Charles Taylor's Ethics of Authenticity. And it resounds with them pretty profoundly. I think it gets through in a good way in a lot of what Taylor says. And no, I start them off actually with subjectivists. I start them off with reading a little bit of Mackey, actually.
I mean, even Kierkegaard, the idea that truth is subjectivity.
Right. But I think the real problem, and I don't see this quite so much with my own students who are, as schools in Boston go, Wentworth is more on the conservative side by virtue of the fact that most of the students are first-generation college students coming from blue-collar, working families. But when I encounter students who are even, graduate students, professors from, say, Northeastern, which is right across the street, or from Harvard or MIT, oftentimes they have an attitude. It's not really so much even a conscious notion, but they have this idea that what's experienced in my consciousness is ultimately incommunicable to someone else. That there's this wall between lived experience and the content of experience, and what's really important is what's going on behind that wall. That there's something really incommunicable that can't be.
There's truth to that, right?
Well, I mean, there's a certain amount of truth to it, right? But at the same time, while there's always going to be experiences we have that are ultimately incommunicable, right? There's going to be some aspect of it that we cannot make public or share with someone else. The extent to which they take this is that the majority of our experience is behind that wall. The significance of it is behind. There is no signifying outside of oneself in a meaningful way about these experiences.
What I most commonly found this skepticism of the student is this notion that nothing is definite. Right? And they never tend to reflect on the fact that the statement that nothing is private.
That's right, and they're caught in immediate contradiction of what they try to express. Right?
Yeah.
So they wind up almost with an angelic nature in the sense that they're a genius unto themselves. And again, nothing exists outside of that can be. So you start with John constantly referred to nominalists and solists.
Yeah.
No, and I think that idea that nothing is definite in some way has been this sort of trickle-down idea from bad practice of evolutionary science. And this idea that there are no kinds at all, because everything's simply these congeries of chance occurrences.
But let me just follow one more time.
Mm-hmm.
Even in that kind of statement, I wonder if there's an intuition there that compared to the ultimate reality of God, compared to the form, perhaps, nothing is definite. And our participation in that is limited and finite and mostly distorted. I'm thinking of just reading somebody like, I'm reading Evelyn Underhill's mystical writings, The Cloud of Unknowing, and they talk about, the instability of human language, the fact that compared to the ultimate reality, our concepts are always lost. I wonder if there's something even there. And then, of course, when they talk about it, they don't even know why they think this. They start talking about evolutionary flux. But I wonder if there's an intuition here of the fact that we're limited, we're finite, and we're perspectival. How are we supposed to sort of have a definite awareness of something absolutely definite? We're just not sort of capable of this. They're sort of right to some extent.
It's true, and that's why we need revelation.
Well, I wouldn't go that far, because that's speeding. I wouldn't want to say that. Hold on. I wouldn't want to say that we can't make certain statements about finite reality and principles without revelation.
I didn't say that.
Okay.
I'm just saying, if you need clarity about what you really believe about things,
I
you're
see.
stuck in this subjectivity.
No, but even,
Nothing's definite.
but even revelation, our grasp of revelation is what? It's mediated by concepts. At best, we can make accurate statements about God, and at the same time it says we know nothing directly about God. We can't comprehend. So I don't know. I'm just wondering.
But Peter just answered the question. Let's see what Peter just said. Stop me scared. He said they're a genus unto themselves. How do you talk to an angel? That will see themselves as angels. They're not above being human.
But they don't really believe.
Oh, sure they do.
They're kind of schizos. They're kind of schizos because they act differently to the way they think.
That's what I think.
Yeah, they will say that, oh, this is bigger than this, right? But they will then claim that there are no relations. So it's not like I've experienced this as bigger as this. No, it is
Well, there's
bigger.
no relation. They're angels.
But isn't some of this, and this is sort of what I found, when we get into this sort of neo-Cartesian, solipsistic kind of thinking, it's an acknowledgement of contingency. Because this could have been different, it could be different, and maybe it is different, and I'm just experiencing it in a
Hey, there are infinite and many worlds where, the same could be different.
But then all they recognize is that this is contingent. But that's all that you recognize. And then I think the problem is when you take that to the further step, which is that, well, now I have no reason to believe that this is real. Well, you're experiencing it.
There's a real danger of trying to engage such people in conversation. Because to engage in profitable conversation, you have to go into the same genes. So immediately they're basically telling you, I can't talk to you.
But there's something that's what I see. This is an experience, and I don't think I don't want to overgeneralize. But there's a cowardice that disguises itself as humility. right?
Yeah.
That says, oh, well, you know, I can't know it. But really, all they're doing is they're afraid to engage. And I think, I think this is a multifaceted problem because I think there's, you know, we've lost the ability to disagree well. You know, I think there's a lot of factors involved. I don't think it's an easy diagnosis.
There's an attitude that authority is always bad.
Yeah, right. However, you know, in changes, there's always something necessary. And I think that's a direction in which.
I'm just talking to the people on camera. It's okay.
You know, for apologetic purposes, what I was trying to get at is like, you can talk to them and say, okay, here's something they're claiming. What they're claiming is fallacy, it's sophistry, and you can show them that. The experience that's leading that claim, like say they're experiencing something contingent, they're experiencing flux. They're experiencing
Peter wanted to end with a sort of discussion about John, so I want to bring that back to that whenever that.
We're gonna have a lot of time for some more discussion. It's just he has to finish a few more things.
Yeah. Well, yes. No. I am done, but
I experienced you.
as I said, I am done, but Dr. Redpath would like to say a few words about John Daly. Yeah.
You want to get up or should I turn?
Yeah, but why don't you just-
Okay.
Several of us knew John, my wife at times will say to me, you know, Peter, you have to be careful because you frighten people. And I said, I don't understand. What do you mean? She said, well, you suck the air out of the room. You know what? So you have to kind of back off. And John has this quality of virtual quantity, of this magnitude of soul that you experience when he walks, you know, in just meeting him for a short time. And the reputation that he has very often, you know, that he's intimidating when you know John. He's this really sensitive soul and eccentric in many ways, but one of the most fascinating people that you ever come across. I remember asking him once, John, how many books do you have in your library? And he either responded 12,000 or 14,000, something to that effect. And we were walking along the street in Warsaw. It's one of my favorite stories about John. And the kiosk, this kiosk in Poland, very often they'll have classic texts, you know, and one of these newsstands that you see on the street corner of New York in Poland, they'd have, you know, a collection of Aristotle or something. So John picks up this this Polish dictionary, and it's you know, enormous, and he I forget how much he paid for it. I think it was about $40, $50, and we walk a couple of blocks away, and he goes, darn it. He says, I have a copy of this. You want to buy this?
Did he give it to you then?
No. I said, no, John, thanks. So, and I know Curtis wanted this, and that's one of my favorite stories about John.
I remember the time I
Turn the mic over.
stayed with him, and he told me, be sure to fly into the hobby, don't fly in the bush. It's easier for me to take him back and go to the hobby. So the day I leave, he takes me back. I see the sniper pull in the terminal, Bush International Airport. He had forgotten the whole arrangement that he wanted to take me to the hobby. Yeah, and that's a minor.
Yes. Very sensitive soul.
With a great sense of humor.
With a great sense of humor, right? And
At our expense, yeah.
at our expense. Very often you had to delve deeply into the meaning of the joke. You know,
Do you remember the joke he told last time I met at a conference with him about some kind of adulterous affair, and it was really like a shocking joke. It was hilarious. I don't know if you remember that. It was a couple of years ago. And that was my first time meeting him.
You'll never forget.
It was a joke. I mean, it was.
Yeah, he didn't have a filter.
No, there was no filter.
Sometimes he'd use analogies.
It was a joke.
So we'll deeply miss John, and we hope that this session has done justice to his memory. And we expect to be keeping in communication with John through the Communion of Saints. So John, we know you're doing well, and drop in and say hello to us periodically with some illumination.
He's probably arguing with Aquinas right now.
Well, that's
At least right.
Both sides of
Arguing about how you know things when you're separated from the body.
They'll be having fun just contemplating.
That wins, that's the prize, how you know things. Step on that.
Well, that, I think, brings the session to an end. I want to thank Brian. Terrific.
Right,
So, dinner's in an hour, right?
I hope that Brooke Deely will view this section from our Congress with a enjoyment that shows the love that we all had for John and how much we appreciate his work. We will hope to continue making his work known in any way that we possibly can in the future. So, Brooke, Good. Thanks.
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 John,
Start teaching your students.
I'm gonna what?
Start teaching your students.
Self-restriction.
Yeah.